Look, I met Putin a number of times in different capacities as a foreign minister and the Speaker of the House and the Minister for Economy. This is a very, I would say, very particular and very sophisticated, both political animal and bastard. I don't trust any word of Putin, any single word. Just let me remind you, before he launched a large-scale invasion against Ukraine, his cronies and he personally was very vocal that they will never launch the war against Ukraine. In the end, what has happened? Putin invaded Ukraine. He sent his thousands of troops at the sovereign territory of Ukraine. So my message to the entire world, don't trust any single word of this war criminal, who is Putin.
President Zelensky has said that his forces, that Ukrainian forces, will target Russian soldiers who shoot at Europe's largest nuclear power plant or who use it as a base from which to launch attacks. His language was very strong, that the individual soldiers would be targeted. But is there any detail on how strategically that might be done?
Well, you know that this is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. On the one hand, this power plant delivers electricity to the entire Ukraine. On the other hand, in case if Russia will still possess this nuclear power plant, this is one of the biggest dangers for the entire Europe. We in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, in the entire world, do remember a Chernobyl nuclear disaster. What Russians are doing, they are trying actually to use this nuclear power plant as a shield. Actually deploying Russian military and not giving Ukrainian military a chance to launch counteroffensive. And Russia decided to make this nuclear power plant as a certain fortress on the one hand, and on the other hand, a spot of suggested terrorist attack committed by Russia against the entire world. So this is a very dangerous situation. I do understand the calls of the United Nations actually to announce Zaporizhia nuclear power plant.
I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you about that because, you know, it's the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who has himself called for this to make it a demilitarized zone. If Russia agreed to it, would Ukraine agree to it too? Or do you want to push the Russian military back across the river away from where the plant is and be allowed to carry out military offensive operations to defend that part of the country?
The only call from the UN I would support is to urge the Russian Federation and President Putin, who committed war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine, just to leave Ukraine, to withdraw entirely from the Ukrainian territory. His aggression occupied a sovereign country, an independent country, and now his actions pose the threat to the entire world. So once again, the only call I underpin and support is Putin withdraw entirely from Ukraine.
Now, as the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, you know President Putin better than all of our listeners here. What is he like when you look him in the eye? Can you believe what he says? What type of character is he? Do you believe suggestions that he himself has changed after his years in office?
Look, I met Putin a number of times in different capacities as a foreign minister and the Speaker of the House and the Minister for Economy. This is a very, I would say, very particular and very sophisticated, both political animal and bastard. I don't trust any word of Putin, any single word. Just let me remind you, before he launched a large-scale invasion against Ukraine, his cronies and he personally was very vocal that they will never launch the war against Ukraine. In the end, what has happened? Putin invaded Ukraine. He sent his thousands of troops at the sovereign territory of Ukraine. So my message to the entire world, don't trust any single word of this war criminal, who is Putin.
Well, you were Prime Minister at the time when Russian troops went into Crimea. You see a huge amount of international backlash against the invasion of Ukraine proper, if you like. I mean, if that sort of international reaction had happened at the time of the invasion to Crimea, do you think the world would be a different place?
You're completely right. I do remember 2014 when I had to convince a number of our Western allies that, look, that's not green men who invaded Crimea. These are Russian forces. And Russian propaganda and Russian intelligence agencies, they were quite successful in actually launching anti-Ukrainian propaganda. So the West had to wake up in 2008 when Putin, during the Munich Security Conference, said that the biggest disaster of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. The West had to wake up when Putin invaded Georgia, and the West had to support Ukrainian aspirations to join NATO in 2008. But as of now, Putin didn't expect this kind of very strong joint response of the Western powers against his aggression. So due to the Western support, British, American support, the European Union, Ukraine withstands, Ukraine fights, and Ukraine will prevail.
Well, I'm really interested at one story that is happening right now, which is that Slovakia is going to ground its fast jets, up to a dozen MiG fighters, next month, and pass them to Ukraine. And to me, I mean, I have a very limited military knowledge. My military service was a long time ago, and it was Army, not RAF. But to me, that seems like a sign of confidence from Slovakia that it doesn't expect Russia to be able to spill this conflict over, and a confidence that Ukraine can actually fight back and push back a lot of the Russian advances.
Yeah, I do commend the efforts of Slovakia and every single state, starting with the US and ending with the United Kingdom, to support Ukrainian military, to make it more durable. And due to the fact that our Western allies decided to supply and to deliver very strong and lethal weapon to Ukraine, we are fighting. Because, look, Russian military is still very strong. I am not in the position to underestimate Russians. This is the biggest threat for the free world, for Ukraine, and for NATO allies. And the gesture and the decision of different governments, including Slovaks, this is a clear sign that the West believes, that the West strongly believes, that Ukraine will win this sacred and righteous fight.
And in terms of what happens next, how closely do you speak to those that are actually helping conduct and command? Do you know where the next push is going to come?
Well, under the Ukrainian legislation, I can't comment on any kind of military activity. But what's happening on the ground? Putin expected to have a very lightning operation to take over an entire Ukraine. It didn't happen. As of now, we see the capacity of the Russian military, which was exaggerated and overestimated. As of now, all these prognoses and estimations that Ukraine is to fail in 3 days after the large-scale Russian invasions, they failed. So Putin's operation right now is not in the highest stage as Putin expected. But once again, Putin has some kind of minor incremental gains. The thing is that this is to be a grinding and very long war. That's my take. So he wants to drag us into the winter. And the reason why he decided to occupy Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is a part of his military strategy. He wants to freeze Ukraine. He wants actually to shut down, for example, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and in this way to undermine an entire energy system of Ukraine. So the situation is as follows. We are fighting, and what is needed, more stronger sanctions are needed. The West has to ramp up sanctions. We need to impose sanctions on the entire energy export of the Russian Federation, because Putin is already gaining around $1 billion per day. And this way he's financing his military machine. We need to impose secondary sanctions. We need actually to have very tough talks with these countries that try to support Russia to bypass and to avoid sanctions. And a large-scale supply of lethal weapon to Ukraine is to be on its way.